Robert Clive was the East India Company's first governor of Bengal, victor at the Battle of Plassey, and arguably the founder of the British Empire in India. And yet, he is also a highly controversial figure, not just now, but back in his own day too. He was accused of accumulating huge personal wealth whilst presiding over a system that ruined the Bengal economy and cost the lives of millions in a famine. British cartoonists called him Lord Vulture, and he was forced to defend himself in front of a parliamentary committee. Following my recent programme about the Battle of Plassey, over 280 of you, including Darren Marsh, Neil Morrison, Harry Shriver, have got in touch requesting that I tell the story of Robert Clive. So, this is for all of you. Robert Clive, Clive of India.
Robert Clive was born into a family of minor gentry near Market Drayton in the English county of Shropshire in 1725. He was a wayward youth who as a teenager led a gang running a protection racket in the town, threatening to smash traders' windows if they didn't pay up. Possibly in desperation, in 1774 his father gained him a position in the East India Company in Madras. It was possibly a case of come back a better person or don't come back at all. Young Clive arrived at the British East India Company base at Fort St George, Madras, modern-day Chennai, in June 1744. He was 18. Considering the fame, power and wealth that he would later acquire, his start in India was humble, to say the least. He was employed as a factor or administrative clerk. Now, at this moment in history, the once mighty Mughal Empire, which had ruled most of India, was beginning to fracture. Local rulers who nominally reported into the emperor in Delhi were effectively doing their own thing. And that was most certainly the case down in southeast India, near to British Madras and Fort St George. Here the regional power was the Nizam of Hyderabad. On the coast itself, the Nawab of the Carnatic was semi-autonomous, but owed his allegiance to the Nizam. It's all very confusing. And into this volatile mix of powerful Nizams and Nawabs vying for power entered European trading companies. In light of future history, it is easy to think that the British East India Company were the only player. But the Portuguese, the Dutch, the Danes and even the Austrians were at it. But the biggest were the British and their traditional rivals, the French, who were based close to Madras at Pondicherry.
These East India companies built forts and garrisoned them with their own troops to protect their trade from their rivals. They even developed their own navies. And whilst commercial competition wasn't in itself necessarily a reason for hostilities, these East India companies were conducting their activities against the backdrop of European conflicts. The War of Austrian Succession, which erupted in 1744, soon found its way to India in the form of the First Carnatic War, which found the British and the French supporting rival Indian regimes.
In September 1746, the French captured the British fort at Madras. Clive, however, was able to escape and make his way to another British outpost, Fort St David, 50 miles to the south. There, the 21-year-old commercial agent Robert Clive enlisted in the army, despite having no military training. The following year, March 1747, he saw his first action when the French and the Nawab of the Carnatic attacked Fort St David. Clive was part of a successful defence which saw him raised to the rank of ensign, the most junior officer rank. Clive came to the attention of his commanders when later in the campaign he participated in the attack on the fort at Devikoti. Clive, now promoted to lieutenant, commanded 30 British and 700 sepoys. In a move that became his military hallmark, he led an attack across the river to the walls of the fort. His bold move disconcerted the defenders, who abandoned their positions, and the fort was captured.
Interestingly, also fighting for the British in this battle was a soldier by the name of James Gray. But Gray had a secret. He was actually a woman, Hannah Snell, who dressed up as a man and joined the army. Taking a musket ball to the groin in this battle, she performed her own DIY surgery to remove it so that doctors wouldn't discover her secret. So, by default, she is the first woman to ever serve in the Royal Marines. I've actually told her story in a short 10-minute episode. Check it out at the end. Anyway, back to Robert Clive. Definitely a man.
After a period of peace, war broke out again in 1751 when a French-sponsored ruler, Chanda Sahib of the Carnatic states, attacked a neighbouring British-backed ruler. Clive, now aged 25, offered to lead a diversionary attack against Chanda's main fortress at Arcot. He was given a force of 200 Europeans and 300 sepoys. Once more, he relied on the element of surprise and boldly conducted a series of nighttime marches through torrential rain. Clive entered the fort unopposed on the 31st of August 1751. However, Carnatic and French forces now besieged his small garrison for 53 days. Eventually, on the 14th of November, Chanda Sahib's son led an all-out assault on the fortress. His men, who outnumbered Clive's by 10 to 1, advanced into killing zones, carefully laid out by Clive. Hundreds were killed, for the loss of just 4 British and 2 sepoys among the defenders. The broken Carnatic army withdrew, and the siege was lifted. 2 years later, and with peace finally restored, Clive married Margaret Maskelyne. 18-year-old Margaret had gone to India, having heard that Clive had fallen in love with her portrait. They married in Madras in 1753 and would go on to have 9 children, one of whom would become the governor of Bengal. Robert and Margaret Clive now returned to England. Having unsuccessfully tried to establish a career in Parliament, Clive returned to India in 1755 with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the Royal Army. In June 1756, the Nawab of Bengal had taken the East India Company's trading fort at Calcutta. It led to a major loss of revenue for the company and also resulted in the Black Hole of Calcutta incident. Now, I've covered that incident in a previous episode, and I'll post a link in the description. In January 1757, with the assistance of the Royal Navy, Clive retook Calcutta. Then, in a nighttime attack in thick mist, he stormed the Nawab's camp. It was another example of his tactic of surprise. When the mist lifted, he found himself in the centre of the camp and surrounded. He turned his force around and fought their way out. Now, history is often about perspectives. One view could be that Clive had had a very lucky escape, and the Nawab could have finished him off. The Nawab, on the other hand, believed that he himself had had a lucky escape and made terms with Clive. I've told this story in my episode all about the Battle of Plassey, so I'm not going to repeat it here. If you're interested, check it out at the end. The Nawab had made a variety of enemies in Bengal, and these now approached Clive to assist with the regime change. Clive offered to make a disgruntled relative, Mir Jafar, the new Nawab. In return, Mir Jafar agreed to pay the East India Company £1 million for their losses in Calcutta, and the cost of the subsequent war. He also agreed a further £800,000 to merchants in the trading port. Overall, that is something like £170 million in today's money, an eye-watering amount to grab a throne. Events came to a head at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. As I said, I've told that story before and I will post a link to it in the description. As a battle, it wasn't a particularly bloody affair. Clive lost very few Europeans and just 22 sepoys. Bengali losses were in the region of 500 killed. The key result, however, was that the Nawab fled after Mir Jafar and some other generals deserted. And with the Nawab's power gone, Clive installed Mir Jafar on the throne. Clive, now appointed governor of Bengal by the East India Company, entered the Bengali capital, and Mir Jafar showed him the treasury and invited him to take what he wanted. Clive duly took about 1/10 of the treasury, equivalent to over £20 million in today's money. A further £80 million in today's money was distributed amongst his troops and sailors and the directors of the East India Company. He also received estates, which provided a significant income in their own right, like several £1 million a year in modern terms.
This opportunity to get rich quick was an example that others in the East India Company followed, not least by taking advantage of a further concession eked out by Clive from Mir Jafar. The new Nawab agreed to exempt the company and their employees from all duties normally levied on trade in Bengal. This is what business schools might call a competitive advantage. Suddenly, employees from the most senior to the lowest clerk were presented with a golden opportunity to trade on terms more beneficial than any other Europeans and the local Bengalis too. The new system allowed them to force the local Indians to basically buy high and sell cheap to the company employees. It was a license to print money. And in the process, they ruined the normally wealthy Bengal economy.
Clive remained governor for 3 years before heading to Britain in 1760. The former teenage tearaway returned home with a fortune estimated of at least £50 million in today's money. He was just 35 years old. Clive was lionised as the hero of Plassey. The Prime Minister, William Pitt the Elder, declared him a heaven-born general. Received at court by the King, he was elevated to the Irish peerage as Baron Clive of Plassey. Being an Irish peer meant that he could still become a Member of Parliament. All he had to do was find a seat. And strangely enough, as the hero of Plassey and with a vast fortune, it didn't take him long. In 1761, he was elected MP for Shrewsbury in his home county of Shropshire. He would hold the seat for the next 13 years. Using his newfound wealth, he also managed to fund the entry into Parliament of 7 of his friends and supporters, a not insignificant block with which to launch your political career. Speaking of buying, he also bought estates in Shropshire, Monmouthshire, Surrey and Ireland. He also purchased a townhouse in London at Berkeley Square. Clive wasn't alone in returning and buying a place in high society. More and more so-called Nabobs, a corruption of Nawabs, were returning from India with outrageous riches. But not everyone was impressed by Clive's and his fellow Nabobs' new status. Many didn't like those returning from India with this new overnight wealth. They were seen as crass, flash, new money. In other words, cash but no breeding. An example of Clive's own flashiness was to spend £10 million in today's money employing Capability Brown to redesign Claremont House in Surrey, and he caused a sensation in London when he ordered 200 shirts from his tailor. However, there were others in Britain who were disturbed by exactly how Clive and the other Nabobs had actually acquired their wealth.
Rumours swiftly spread that bribery, corruption and exploitation were rife amongst these Nabobs in Bengal.
Meanwhile, back in Bengal, it was all starting to go wrong. With ever-increasing financial demands from the company and its employees, Mir Jafar finally rebelled. He'd invited the Dutch East India Company to help him expel the British. In 1759, a Dutch force was defeated by Colonel Francis Ford, and Mir Jafar was booted off his throne. The East India Company replaced him with his son-in-law, Mir Kazim. But if they hoped for a compliant puppet, they were in for a surprise. Mir Kazim formed a triple alliance with the neighbouring state of Oudh and the Mughal Emperor to expel the British from Bengal. Clive was now sent back to Bengal with combined responsibilities of governor and commander-in-chief, with the rank of Major General, to save the situation for the company. By the time he arrived in April 1765, the Indian armies had actually been defeated at the Battle of Buxar by Major Hector Munro. That victory at Buxar made the British the preeminent military power in northern India, in a way that Plassey hadn't. Clive had arrived just in time to take full political advantage of that victory. But before that, Clive sent a coded letter to a friend in England, advising him to mortgage his properties and buy as many East India Company shares as possible before the official news of the victory arrived back in Britain. In other words, Clive was practicing a bit of insider trading. On the 12th of August 1765, Governor Clive met the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam. On a makeshift throne of a chair placed on top of a table in Clive's tent, Shah Alam granted the East India Company full rights to collect all taxes and duties in Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. Apart from sending the Emperor an annual tribute, the rest of those monies were the East India Company's and its shareholders. The company were now the military and de facto political power in Bengal. They ruled a population of 30 million people, 4 times the size of Britain at the time. A trading company had become an imperial ruler. With the foundations of an empire in place, Clive now tried to reform the East India Company administration in Bengal, in particular to end the widespread levels of bribery, corruption and extortion that had been rampant since 1757, and if anything, had got even worse in Clive's absence. His first order was to prohibit East India Company employees receiving gifts from Indians. He followed up by announcing that henceforth the same employees could not conduct their side hustles. This actually led to a mutiny by European officers in the company army, which he successfully quelled. The problem for both Clive and those employees was the whole reason those side hustles were all the rage was because of the low wages paid by the company. Despite his pleas, the directors in London refused to increase them. So to try and remedy this situation, Clive set up a salt monopoly from which employees of the company were paid from the profits. Nevertheless, despite Clive's policies, corruption remained rife for many years to come. Clive's second term as governor of Bengal ended in 1767. In February of that year, suffering from nervous and gastric disorders as well as a bout of malaria, he left India for the last time. Would he return to Britain a hero again?
Before I tell you, if you've got this far, then you're probably enjoying this story. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to give me a like, post a comment, or subscribe to my YouTube channel. You might also be interested in my supporters club. Details at the end and in the description below. So let's find out what happened to Robert Clive when he got back to Britain.
He arrived back in Britain to less of a fanfare than in 1760. More and more people seemed to dislike the opulent wealth of the Nabobs, and even more were having serious moral concerns about how the East India Company were conducting themselves in India. Two events brought matters to a head. In 1772, the East India Company appealed to the government to save it from bankruptcy. Politicians and commentators in Britain were aghast. What on earth had the company been doing with all that wealth of Bengal? By then, however, a humanitarian disaster had occurred in India. In 1769, the monsoon rains failed and Bengal was struck by a famine. Whilst estimates vary, anywhere between 7 and 10 million Indians died. What little food there was became unaffordable due to the tax burden imposed by the East India Company. During this period of famine, company officials sent tax revenue equivalent to £100 million in today's money from Bengal to the East India Company HQ in London. At the height of the famine, shareholders voted to increase their dividends by over 10%. A shocked British Parliament established a committee of inquiry to examine company practices in Bengal. They uncovered continuing widespread corruption, despite Clive's efforts to stamp it out. Whilst the inquiry was supposedly about company rule, it soon turned on the man most easily identified with this whole new empire in India, Robert Clive. The hero of Plassey now faced enemies ranging from humanitarians shocked at the famine, politicians uncomfortable with the business practices of the company and Clive himself, social snobs who disliked Nabobs, and now some Nabobs and would-be Nabobs who felt that he had prevented them getting even richer. The previous year, Town and Country, a satirical magazine, compared Clive to Emperor Nero, enriching himself while Bengal starved. Whilst another, entitled The India Directors in the Suds, suds being a euphemism for excrement, showed Clive being confronted by a line of Indian ghosts representing the victims of the famine. In the press, other satirical cartoons referred to Clive as Lord Vulture and the Madras Tyrant. At the Committee of Inquiry, Clive was attacked by radical MP Edmund Burke. But worse was to come from the committee chairman himself. General John Burgoyne, the MP for Preston and one of Clive's most vocal critics, pressed the case that some of Clive's riches had come at the expense of the company and the British government. In other words, he was corrupt. Clive responded, "I stand astonished at my own moderation."
In the end, a vote to censure Clive was defeated by 155 votes to 95. Instead, he was thanked for his great and meritorious services to his country. Maybe the result was no real shock, seeing as a quarter of MPs at that time had some sort of financial interest in the East India Company. 4 years later, General Burgoyne would ignominiously surrender his British army to the Americans at the Battle of Saratoga. But by then, however, Robert Clive was dead.
On the 22nd of November 1774, whilst playing a game of cards with his wife and some friends at his house in Berkeley Square, Clive excused himself and went upstairs. He was later found dead, having severed his jugular with a penknife. There was no suicide note, and many speculated as to why he took his life. Some pointed to a history of depression and at least one attempted suicide earlier in his life. Others speculated that it was drug-induced, as there were rumours that he had become increasingly reliant on opium. Samuel Johnson suggested it was suicide due to a guilty conscience for his actions in Bengal. Robert Clive was just 49 years old. Interestingly, Another highly controversial imperialist, Cecil Rhodes, was also 49 when he died. Clive was buried with some haste in the churchyard at Morton Say, just outside Market Drayton, in his native Shropshire. In these post-colonial times, Clive is a controversial character. What people tend to forget was that he was controversial in his own day too. Not everyone saw East India Company rule in Bengal as a benign influence. And as you can see from the satirical cartoons and direct attacks on him in Parliament, he had many enemies. Even though his actions were exonerated in the parliamentary vote, nearly 40% of MPs voted against him. Apart from a marble bust in the East India Company headquarters in Leadenhall Street, London, there were no monuments to Clive, the empire maker, for nearly 100 years. And even then, it was in Shrewsbury, the county town of his native Shropshire. Apart from that statue, there was no other during the Victorian heyday of the British Empire, which is a bit odd when you look at how many statues from this period litter British cities and elsewhere in the Commonwealth.
Maybe following the disastrous Indian Revolt of 1857, when the British government were forced to take control of India from the company, many Victorians might have been somewhat unsure whether Clive was a hero or not. And at the beginning of the 20th century, Lord Morley, Secretary of State for India, mused that maybe it would have been best for Britain and India if Clive had lost the Battle of Plassey.
It wasn't until just before the First World War that the famous statue to Clive in Whitehall, London, was erected. And even then, it was largely funded by a former Viceroy of India, Lord Curzon, rather than public subscriptions. Curzon's successor as Viceroy, Lord Minto, saw the statue as needlessly provocative at a time of rising Indian nationalism. The statue was finally placed in an alley between the Foreign and Indian offices, where it stands to this day. And maybe that slightly obscure position in Whitehall sums up Robert Clive. Is he someone to be looked up to or vilified? For the case against, historian William Dalrymple describes him as both an unstable sociopath and a vicious asset stripper. Clive is accused of impoverishing the once wealthy Bengal and presiding over rampant corruption by East India Company officials who were following his lead. And whilst he wasn't actually governor during the famine of 1770, the hardships suffered had a direct line to the vigorous taxation and exploitation during his tenure. Even militarily, whilst Plassey brought about a regime change in Bengal, it was Major Hector Munro's victory at Buxar that established unrivalled British power in the north of India. On the other side of the argument, it's argued that Clive found himself at the head of a trading company suddenly ruling 30 million people. There was no company civil service, and the resulting administrative vacuum was open to exploitation. Some cast him as more of a product of a corrupt system than the instigator. Undoubtedly, with his regime change post-Plassey and then his treaty with the Mughal Emperor giving the East India Company the authority to collect taxes in Bengal, Clive was instrumental in establishing the British Empire in India. And here's one more thing. Major General Robert Clive, victor at Arcot, Calcutta and Plassey, was not simply a successful military commander, but one who had no military training, a natural commander in the tradition of, say, Oliver Cromwell. So, is he a hero, a villain, or a bit of both? I'll let you decide. Drop me a comment. Whatever his pros and cons, Robert Clive, rather like his statue, casts a long shadow over both Indian and British history to this day.
If you enjoy my stories and would like to explore more forgotten tales from British history, then why not join my supporters club? This week, for instance, we were looking at the Battle of Castillon, the last battle in the 100 Years' War, 19th century Prime Minister Lord Melbourne, and King Edward I's eviction of the Jews from England. Now, if that's the sort of exploring British history that appeals to you, check it out. There's a link in the description below. And thanks to Mark, Andrew and Timothy for recently joining. What would you love to hear about in the future? I've recently had suggestions for the Battle of Buxar, which we talked about today, the British Wars with Tipu Sultan, the Tiger of Mysore, and Cecil Rhodes. And I've added all three of those to my list for future productions. Post your request in the comments below. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I'll see you again very soon.